Well, tonight we should have a humorous and interesting conversation about, I think it's one of the Old Testament stories that a lot of people are familiar with, and we're going to go into it in depth. And that is about the king of Moab, Balak, commissioning a false prophet, Balaam, to curse the people of Israel. And they're trying to, this is all about a scheme to finesse God into reversing his position toward Israel and to bring a curse on Israel instead of a blessing. And it's also a story that talks about how people that are pagan and don't believe in God can just do all sorts of things to scheme and plot and try to override God's will and finesse God into and manipulate God into doing something they want instead of what God has decreed. So we are going to talk about 4 different chapters in the book of Numbers and a couple of verses from the book of Deuteronomy and some other verses that talk about this false prophet named Balaam. So before we get into it, I wanted to remind you of last week's study. We learned that after journeying through the wilderness for 38 years, the Israelites began their conquest of the Amorite kingdoms, which occupied the mountainous areas east of the Dead Sea and east of the Jordan River. We learned that the Israelites were acting as God's agents in faithful obedience to God's command for them to conquer and completely destroy the Amorite kingdoms. And we had a little bit of a discussion about, is there a difference between the God of wrath of the Old Testament and the God of mercy and grace in the New Testament? But we learned that these Amorite kingdoms they stored up God's wrath against them for all of their evil pagan practices. The Amorites were a larger group than the Canaanites. The Canaanites, a subgroup of the Amorites, and they worshiped a pagan god, and part of their worship were sexual orgies. The other part of the worship was taking their live children and burning them in the fire as a sacrifice to their pagan gods. God let this go on until the wrath was stored up against them, and then he used Israel as his agent to rid the earth of these evil people. The main message that we got from last week's study was that God, in his righteousness, used Israel to justly punish the Amorites and for the wrath that they stored up against them. And he wanted Israel to remove the Amorites from the land, but the removal was only a partial fulfillment of one of God's characteristics, and that is his righteousness. We know that the full measure of God's wrath and his righteousness was served by Jesus Christ, who died on the cross, bearing the sins of all mankind, past, present, and future, and that justified God in his righteousness, as well as the sacrifice and atonement for our sins. Now, this week, as I mentioned, we'll learn that God in his sovereignty frustrated and overrode King Balak's opposition to the blessings and promises which God bestowed on Israel by prohibiting Balaam from cursing Israel. And so we're going to look at Balak, the king, the fearful king, Balaam, the false prophet, and the donkey who turned out to be the wise donkey. The main message that I want you to get from tonight's lesson is that despite Balak's attempt to manipulate God by hiring Balaam, a pagan prophet, to curse Israel, God always does what he in his sovereignty decides to do. And God is always faithful to the promises and covenants that he makes with his chosen people. So God doesn't change, and we're going to see that he doesn't let man manipulate him. His sovereignty is consistent, and it is always in furtherance of his plan of redemption. An outline of what we're going to cover, we're going to talk about how God overrode Balak and Balaam's scheme to curse Israel. We're going to talk about the overview of the situation which the king of Moab was facing, Balaam, the pagan prophet, the wise donkey and the foolish prophet, Balaam's 7 oracles or prophecies, and then a postscript. as it said, and the rest of the story. In part 2, we'll have discussion questions, and then we'll get to the conclusions, applications, and implications. So let's get to the study itself. God overrode Balak and Balaam's scheme to curse Israel. The situation that the king of Moab was facing. Last week we studied how Israel went around Moab, the area controlled by Moab, and they defeated the Amorite king of the city of kingdom of Heshbon. That was Sihon the king. And then they defeated Og, the Amorite king of the city-state kingdom of Bashan. After defeating these Amorite kingdoms, Israel backtracked to the Jordan River on the east side, and they stayed in what they called the plain of Moab. And this is in the Transjordan, north of the river Arnon. And it's an area that goes up to the Jabbok River that flows into the middle part of the Jordan River. And it's really the southern boundary of the Ammonites, which the Israelis did not go into and defeat. Israel established this camp across the Jordan River from where the Jericho is located. And we're going to see that this area where they camped was a staging area for their invasion into the land of Canaan on the west side of the Jordan River that started with the conquest of the city of Jericho. Now, Balak, he was a king of the Moabs. He believed that Israel was invincible because they defeated and utterly destroyed the Amorites. If you remember, the Amorites defeated Moab, and they took the city of Heshbon away from them and occupied that area. And then Israel comes in, and God gave Israel the victory, and it was a complete victory. And so the king of Moab was saying, look at what this nation did to the enemies that conquered me. What can he do to me? And he was afraid of the Israelites. And he also described them as an ox that licks up the grass of the field. Balak was terrified. Now, he did not know, because he was a pagan king, that a long time ago, God promised that the Israelites would not, and directed the Israelites not to destroy Moab. Why? Who were the Moabs? Well, the Moabs were descendants of Lot, which was Abraham's nephew. And so after Lot was rescued from Sodom and Gomorrah, he had his daughters beguiled him into having children with him. And one of the children was Moab. And so they were related to God's promised people, and God forbade Israel from attacking Moab. We're going to see that God changed his mind after he saw what this pagan king lured Israel into doing. Now, because Balak knew that he could not defeat Israel, not with his army, he didn't have the power, he decided to recruit others to help him. First, he conferred with and got into an alliance with the kingdom of Midian, which is immediately to his south. And he wanted them to join in opposition to Israel. Recruit as many people as you can against Israel. The second thing he did is he sought to enlist supernatural powers by sending messengers to a renowned pagan prophet named Balaam. And he was going to ask Balaam to curse Israel. Balaam was from a place south of Kekemish, which is the city, if you remember, Nebuchadnezzar conquered the Assyrians and the Egyptians at Kekemish. Anyway, this is an area in northern Syria, and it's an area where it was the birthplace of Balaam. And Balaam was renowned for his ability to entice and use his sorcery to entice gods from any nation to go and change their blessings into curses for the people that the gods protected. So Balaam had already had a reputation of taking and getting pagan gods to curse the nations that they were recognized as a god for. And so with this reputation, the king of Moab decided that, well, let's get Balaam to come in and curse Israel. He can do it. He's done it to other gods. He can do it to the God of Israel. Now, Balaam was the son of Beor. And like I said, he lived near the Euphrates River, south of the city of Carchemish in modern day Syria. He was a pagan prophet for hire. Jewish scholars later described Balaam as having an evil eye, a haughty bearing, and a avarice or greedy spirit. And that about sums him up. And as we go through this story tonight, you'll see that he meets all of these requirements. But if you look at just these chapters in the book of Numbers, and you look at Balaam and what he actually does, you might get misled into thinking that Balaam was okay and that he recognized the Israeli God as a true God. And even refers to the Hebrew God as Lord. But God, when he speaks to Balaam, he doesn't use the word Lord. He just says God. And so God recognizes that Balaam is a false prophet, and he deals with him as a false prophet. So instead of viewing Balaam in a favorable light because he spoke blessings of Israel instead of curses, let's look at some of the other scriptures in the Bible that talk about Balaam and what the scriptures say about Balaam. In Deuteronomy 23, verses 4 and 5, Balaam is described as one who wanted to curse Israel, even though God would not allow him to do so. What we have here is a false prophet dealing with the true God, and he's frustrated. He wants to curse Israel and get paid that money, but God wouldn't let him do it. In 2 Peter chapter 2, verse 15, Balaam is referred to as a pagan prophet who loved the wages of wickedness. So a reference to his greed and avarice for money. In Jude 11, false prophets are described as those who rushed for profit into Balaam's error. So he's talking about how false prophets are lured into following what Balaam established in the book of Numbers. In the book of Revelations chapter 2, verse 14, the church of Pergamon is compared to the teachings of Balaam, who taught Balak to entice the Israelites to sin by eating food sacrificed to idols and by committing sexual immorality. The book of Revelations tells the rest of the story about Balaam and how after he was discharged by Balak, the king of Moab, he then counseled the king of Moab on how to seduce Israel into disobeying God, and then that would get God to curse Israel for their disobedience. So what he couldn't accomplish one way, he decided to go around about and do it a different way. As the story of Balak and Balaam unfolds, we learn that Balaam was a wicked man who's held pagan beliefs about God and religion, pursued his greed, but was foiled by God from doing what he wanted to do in order to be paid. So we're going to see the whole thing be put together. So the wise donkey and the foolish prophet. After conferring with Midian, Balak sent messengers to recruit Balaam to curse Israel. Numbers chapter 22, verses 4 and 6 says, so Balak, son of Zippor, who was king of Moab at that time, sent messengers to summon Balaam, son of Beor, who was at Pethar near the river Euphrates, in his native land. Balak said, a people have come out of Egypt. They cover the face of the land and have settled next to me. Now come and put a curse on these people because they are too powerful for me. Perhaps then I will be able to defeat them and drive them out of the country. For I know that those you bless are blessed and those you curse are cursed. So he's referring to Balaam's reputation. The messengers which Balak sent to summon Balaam were elders from both Moab and from Midian. So that reflects the alliance that was made against Israel. The messengers brought with them a large sum of money to pay for Balaam's divination. At first, God appeared in a vision to Balaam and instructed him not to go, saying, do not go with them. You must not put a curse on those people because they are blessed. The messengers returned to Balak and told the king that Balaam had refused to come back with them. But Balaam didn't end it there. He kept on asking the Lord to let him go. Even though he refused and followed God's instructions, he was still pestering God. Undeterred, Balak sent a second delegation of princes, more numerous and more distinguished than the first delegation, with a message that Balaam would be rewarded handsomely if he would come and place a curse on Israel. I could just see Balaam getting the second delegation, the most important princes, and a handsome reward. And he's just wringing his hand saying, "Oh God, if you just let me go, just let me go." So this time, God appeared to Balaam in a vision and told Balaam to return with the second delegation, but do only what I tell you to. So the Lord is saying, "Oh, you can go, but you better obey me." The next morning, Balaam saddled up his donkey and went with the princes of Moab. But God sent an angel to confront Balaam. 3 times the angel stood in the road holding a sword to oppose Balaam. At first, Balaam did not see the angel, but the donkey did. The first time that the angel appeared on the road, the donkey turned off the road into a field, and Balaam beat the donkey until the donkey got back on the road and started traveling again. The second time that the angel appeared on a narrow pathway between 2 vineyards with stone walls on both sides, the donkey pressed close to one of the walls, crushing Balaam's foot. And again, Balaam beat the donkey. Now, the third time the angel appeared before Balaam and the donkey, there was no room to turn to the right or the left. So the donkey, seeing this angel, just lay down underneath Balaam and refused to move, just like the donkey would be prone to do. This time the Lord opened the donkey's mouth, enabling the donkey to speak to Balaam, asking Balaam, "What have I done to you that you make you beat me these 3 times?" Balaam answered the donkey, telling her that she made a fool out of him and that if he had a sword, he'd kill her. Well, the Lord then opened Balaam's eyes so that Balaam was able to see the angel of the Lord standing in the road, holding a sword, drawn to kill Balaam. After Balaam fell face down before the angel spoke to Balaam. Numbers chapter 22, verses 32 through 35. The angel of the Lord asked him, Balaam, "Why have you beaten your donkey these 3 times? I have come here to oppose you because your path is a reckless one before me. The donkey saw me and turned away from me these 3 times. If she had not turned away, I have certainly have killed you by now, but I would have spared her." Balaam said to the angel of the Lord, "I have sinned. I did not realize you were standing in the road to oppose me. Now, if you're displeased, I will go back." The angel of the Lord said to Balaam, "Go with the men, but speak only what I tell you." So now we have this interaction between Balaam, the donkey, and this angel. There's so much irony in this, and I try to list all the ways that the irony comes out in these scriptures. Balaam claimed to be a seer, but he could not see the angel standing in front of him with the sword drawn to kill him. Balaam boasted that he was able to speak truthfully the words of God, but the donkey, who was incapable of speaking, spoke the truth. Balaam reacted with brutal anger by beating the donkey, but the donkey acted faithfully towards his master. For all his pomp and circumstance, Balaam is shown as being dumber than his donkey. Just as Balaam pushed his donkey onward despite the angel blocking his way, Balak was pushing Balaam to curse Israel, even though God repeatedly prohibited Balaam from doing so. Just as God opened the donkey's mouth to speak to Balaam, God opened Balaam's mouth to bless Israel instead of cursing Israel as he is commissioned to do. Just as the donkey was caught between the angel of God with his drawn sword and Balaam's fit of anger, Balaam himself was caught between what God had ordered or ordained him to say and Balak's rage because Balaam was not cursing Israel. Finally, Balaam, not the donkey, is seen as the fool, and Balaam is humiliated by his own donkey. So those are all the ironies, and you probably could come out with some more, but it's just, I think this really shows God's sense of humor and miraculous power, because first of all, I've never met a donkey that could speak, let alone a donkey that had the shape of a mouth and a tongue that could even form words, and not a donkey that could talk back and forth and be wiser than the person that's riding him. This is a miracle. God opened the mouth of the donkey, gave him the ability to speak, and gave him the words to tell Balaam, who was punishing him because he was stopping in front of the angel. So Balaam went on. He met with the king of Moab, Balak. Balak was in a hurry and was to get Balaam to curse Israel. And so the next two chapters, chapters 23 and chapter 4 of the book of Numbers, contain 4 major oracles which Balaam gave regarding God's blessings and promises for Israel, and then 3 short oracles regarding other nations, a total of 7 oracles. The oracles first emphasized that God had selected Israel to be a distinct and holy people, and then reaffirmed God's steadfast faithfulness to the covenants that God made with Israel. So the big picture of what these oracles are about is that God basically chose Israel to bless them, and that God was steadfast in holding on to the promises he made to Israel's ancestors and the covenant that he made with the nation of Israel. The final 3 oracles look to the future of Israel and point to the coming of Jesus as the King and Messiah. So let's get into the oracles themselves. Balaam's first 4 oracles. The first oracle, found in Numbers chapters 23, verses 1 through 12, Balak takes Balaam to a high place overlooking the Israelite camp, where he made 7 altars and slaughtered 7 rams and 7 bulls. So on each altar, a bull and a lamb were slaughtered 7 times, a total of 14 animals. Now, after that, Balaam tells King Balak, I'm going to step aside and consult with the Lord, and then I'll come back and tell you what the Lord says. Instead of cursing Israel, when Balaam came back, he tells Balak that he can't curse Israel. He can't curse those who God has not cursed, nor denounce those who God has not denounced. Balaam tells Balak that God has chosen to bless Israel. And that's it. In Numbers chapter 23, verses 7 through 10, the oracle reads, Balak brought me from Aram, the king of Moab, from the eastern mountains. Come, he said, curse Jacob for me. Come, denounce Israel. How can I curse those whom God has not cursed? How can I denounce those whom the Lord has not denounced? From rocky peaks I see them. From the heights I view them. I see people who live apart and do not consider themselves one of the nations. Who can count the dust of Jacob or the number the 4th part of Israel? Let me die the death of the righteous, and may my end be like theirs. Basically saying, I can't undo what God has done. He's chosen to Israel as his people. He's chosen to bless Israel. And how can I counter the God that has chosen to do this? And he says, I can see them, and they're no, I can't even count the number. In fact, I see them camped. If you remember, there's 4 parts of Israel camped around the tabernacle. And he says, just 1/4 of them, I can't even count them. How can I count the whole group? And he says, let me die of their righteousness. He's not saying I will die of their righteousness, because he's not a righteous person, but he's saying, oh, if God had blessed me. So the first, it fails. And what is Balak's response? He's saying, well, maybe if you don't look at all of the camp of Israelites, you won't be intimidated by their numbers. So he takes them to the top of Mount Pigash, another high place that overlooks only a smaller portion of the Israelite encampment, believing presumably that he would not be overwhelmed by the large number of the Israelites and then be able to curse them. Again, Balak made 7 altars and slaughtered 7 rams and 7 bulls, 2 animals for each altar. And again, instead of cursing Israel, Balaam revealed that God had blessed Israel and that Balaam was powerless to override God's blessing. In Numbers chapters 23, 18 through 24, the second oracle reads, Arise, Balak, and listen. Hear me, son of Zippor. God is not a man that he should lie, nor a son of man that he should change his mind. Does he speak and then not act? Does he promise and not fulfill? I've received a command to bless. He is blessed and I cannot change it. No misfortune is seen in Jacob, nor misery observed in Israel. The Lord their God is with them. They shouted, the king is among them. God brought them out of Egypt. They have the strength of a wild ox. There is no sorcery against Jacob, no divination against Israel. It will now be said of Jacob and Israel, see what God has done. The people rise like a lioness. They rouse themselves like a lion that does not rest until he devours his prey and drinks the blood of his victims. If Balak doesn't get the message that God is firm in his blessing of Israel, and Balaam is powerless to override God's sovereignty, nothing will get Balak to do that. But Balak is stubborn, and he thinks that I'm paying good money for this prophet to come in and curse Israel, and doggone it, he's going to do it. So he takes him to a third high place, the top of Mount Peor, which is another high place which overlooked the wasteland. Again, Balak made 7 altars and slaughtered 7 rams and 7 bulls, 2 animals for each altar. Realizing that God would prohibit him from cursing Israel, Balaam yielded himself to the spirit of the Hebrew God, and he did not resort to the sorcery as he did on the previous 2 attempts to curse Israel. So Balaam attempted to use his divination, his sorcery. He attempted to manipulate God 2 times. And then he finally realized, you know what? I'm not dealing with a usual pagan God here. This God is among the Israelites. I can see the tabernacle in their midst. He is with his people. And what can I do? So God, whatever you have to say to me, I guess I'm stuck to say it to Balak. And so seeing Israel encamped tribe by tribe, the Spirit of God came upon Balaam and gave him the oracle about Israel's pending settlement in the promised land, the rise of the monarchy, and Israel's victory over the enemies. Balaam repeated the oracle which the Spirit of God gave to him. In Numbers chapter 24, verses 3 through 9, the oracle reads, the oracle of Balaam, son of Beor, the oracle of one whose eyes sees clearly, the oracle of one who hears the words of God, who sees a vision from the Almighty, who falls prostrate and whose eyes are open. How beautiful are your tents, O Jacob, your dwelling places, O Israel. Like valleys, they spread out, like gardens beside a river, like aloe planted by the Lord, like cedars beside the waters. Water will flow from their buckets. Their seed will have abundant water. The king will be greater than Agag. Their kingdom will be exalted. God brought them out of Egypt, and they have the strength of a wild ox. They devour hostile nations and break their bones in pieces. With their arrows, they pierce them. Like a lion, they crouch and lie down. Like a lioness, who dares to arouse them? May those who bless you be blessed, and those who curse you be cursed. So again, for the third time, I guess that Balak, as a king of Moab, is the slow learner. God is steadfast in blessing Israel, and God, the blessings of Israel, this reference to water, these are desert lands, and water is the way that they have prosperity, agriculture, and the blessings of the Lord. And so what we see here is Balak hears this message for the third time, and he's furious. He tells Balaam, basically, I hired you to curse Israel. You didn't curse Israel. I want you to leave me and depart. You're not going to get paid a cent. And so Balaam basically tells Balak, oh, I'll go, but I want to warn you. And so he gives the final oracles of warning to Balak, the king of Moab. In the fourth oracle, which is found in Numbers chapter 24, verses 15 through 19, it not only foretells Israel's victory over Moab and Edom, which took place when David became king of Israel, but also prophesies the coming of Jesus as the Messianic king. Predicting the coming of a king greater than David, Balaam told Balak that the king would reign over the throne of Israel, and inferred as this is reign forever. In the chapter 24 of the book of Numbers, verses 17 through 19, the oracle reads, I see him, but not now. So he's saying, I'm seeing Israel of the future. I behold him. Let me turn the page here. Not near. A star will come out of Jacob. A scepter will rise out of Israel. He will crush the foreheads of Moab. The skulls of all the sons of Shea is Edom will be conquered. Seir, his enemy, will be conquered. But Israel will grow strong. A ruler will come out of Jacob and destroy the survivors of the city. So most scholars interpret this not only a prophecy of the future of Israel completely defeating the kingdoms of Moab and Edom, but also a prophecy of Jesus as the Messiah coming to reign over Israel forever. Then we get to the last three minor prophecies or oracles. The fifth oracle predicts the destruction of the Amalekites. If you remember, the Amalekites were the first people to attack Israel after they departed from Egypt. The sixth oracle predicts the destruction of the Kenites. The Kenites were descendants of Abraham's second wife. After Sarah died, he married again and she had descendants, and the Kenites were descendants of them. The seventh and last oracle refers to ships from Kittim defeating Ashur, which was Assyria, and defeating Eber, which is a reference to Mesopotamia or Babylon, and eventually being defeated by another. Most scholars believe that the ships represented either Alexander the Great, coming from the Mediterranean Sea, or later the Roman Empire. So there we have the story of the fearful king, the false prophet, and the wise donkey. Now let's, like Harvey said, the rest of the story, the postscript. Although Balaam left the company of Balak, he is credited with advising Balak to send Moabite women, probably priestess of Baal, to go into the Israeli camp and seduce the Israelite men to committing apostasy. In chapter 25, the scriptures reveal that many Israelites indulged in sexual immorality with these Moabite women who were sent to seduce them and cause them to participate in making sacrifices to their pagan gods. Many Israelites joined in worshiping the Baal of Peor. God instructed Moses to take all the leaders of those who committed the heresy against God and kill them. In Numbers chapter 25, verse 5, God instructs Moses. So Moses said to the Israel's judges, each of you must put to death those of your men who have joined in worshiping the Baal of Peor. In addition to punishing the leaders, killing them, God also sent a plague which killed 24,000. The plague sent by God was stopped when Phinehas, the grandson of Aaron, killed an Israelite man and his Midianite woman who openly defied Moses and others right in front of the tent of the meeting. What they did is they went into a tent and Phinehas followed him into the tent and took his spear. And even though the scriptures are not clear, the inference and the practices are pretty clear that these women, that this man and this woman were engaged in intercourse. And you have pictures of Phinehas taking the spear and jabbing it through the man and through the woman and killing them both. And so what we have is Phinehas's zeal for God's holiness ended the plague and elevated Phinehas' priestly status. It's from this that God promised Phinehas and all his descendants to be the high priests of Israel, even up into the millennial period. Now, as for Balaam, he stayed in Midian, and ultimately he was killed when Israel took revenge against Moab and Midian for deceiving Israel in the affair or the incident of Peor. So what we have in Numbers chapter 31 is Israel taking revenge against Moab at God's command and against Midian, attacking them and killing most of the Moabites and defeating the Midians. And in that group, there was Balaam sitting there and being killed along with the rest of the armies. So this is a most interesting story. It's It's humorous, it's ironic, but it's going to get even more interesting with the questions that I'm going to ask you. So we're going to turn to the discussion questions. They start on page 15 of the outline. Go to the implications, conclusions, and applications. God in his sovereignty remained faithful to the promises which he made to Israel's patriarchs and to the covenant he made with the nation of Israel. When Balak, the pagan king, and Balaam, a pagan prophet, attempted to manipulate God, God in a miraculous and humorous way reversed and frustrated their efforts, demonstrating God's absolute sovereignty over beast and man. When compelled to obey God, even a donkey and a false prophet can be used to speak God's truth, to carry out God's will, and to give glory to God. Man and kingdoms are powerless to oppose God or frustrate God's will. Balaam's greed, avarice, and love of money motivated him to attempt to satisfy Balak's demand for him to curse Israel. However, his fear of God prevented him from receiving the fee promised him. The story of Balak, Balaam, and the donkey humorously illustrates that men cannot serve both God and money. The fact that God used a pagan, unbelieving diviner and a donkey to speak the truth of his word teaches us that God is more than able to use us as believers to speak the truth of his word to others. If he can use a donkey, he certainly can use us.
Amen.
He can even use Bob Fry.